Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tweak.Test.Repeat. My name is Mr. Umer and I'll be going over overclocking your GPU. That's your graphics processing unit. So the GPU, if you've watched our other videos, deals with accelerating graphics, while the CPU deals with accelerating things like math. So graphics are what we see right away. They're things that we see in games and in content creation. Content creation being like Adobe Photoshop, Handbrake, Blender, graphics type programs can also be 3D rendering. It could be 3ds Max, it could be AutoCAD. The graphics card is also used for gaming, so and that's a pretty big market. A lot of games they require a lot of horsepower. Nowadays, you might see a lot of manufacturers like Apple trying to say, well, we can do a lot of graphics processing within a small envelope using just an ARM CPU and a GPU. And a lot of them will say, well, they're high performance. Look at this benchmark. We're really doing very fast and efficient things with a low amount of power. But in actuality, when you're on a desktop, not a laptop, there's less thermal constraints. So in a laptop, I can understand you're going to want to keep the CPU and GPU power at bay so that you don't melt your battery, so that you don't melt your computer. On a desktop, uh, you may come with more higher capacity power supplies. As an example, in this build that I have right now, I'm running around 950 watts from a Corsair power supply unit. A typical laptop will most likely have two power limits. They call it P1 and P2. P1 being probably around 40 watts, uh, P2 probably being around 100 watts or even more. It just depends on the type of configuration. You'll see some of the Apple or the new Apple M1 laptops, they'll say, well, our laptop can do what a PS5 or Xbox or even a PC can do at just 10 or 15 watts. So it's kind of hard to believe. You might see a lot of product demos where, we're running Tomb Raider. Look, we can do that. And if you really dive into the details, though, they've come a long way, Apple, but really accelerating graphics, you need horsepower, and that requires power. Uh, no matter how small you may condense the manufacturing. For example, the GPUs that I'm running right now, the NVIDIA Geforce RTX 3090 is run on an 8 nanometer process. If you look at the Apple M1, their CPUs probably around 5 nanometer, their GPU probably a little larger than that. So when they say, well, we have a lot of performance, they're running, when they try to run a real graphics game, I'm not talking about Adobe Photoshop, when they run a game at even just the lowest resolution, let's say 720p, they're not getting very good frame rates. Uh, I've seen some where they get around 17, 20 frames per second. They might improve the frame rate by decreasing the graphics set on real low. So I've seen some where they're running 720p, very low settings. Maybe they hit 60 frames per second. That's probably a more acceptable, more pleasing type frame rate, but then the graphics are really mediocre. So on a PC platform, Xbox or PS5, typically the gamer is going to want to run, you know, something that has decent frame rates around 60 or less. They'll be lucky to hit 120. Some games support that for those console type platforms with at least medium to high graphic settings. When you're on a PC, they call us the PC Master Race. It's because we can run hardware that can go from 1080p to 4K to even 8K gaming. So one of the things that is an advantage of being on a PC is that you can overclock. So overclocking is basically you have a product that runs at a certain specified spec, a speed, and that's in megahertz or gigahertz, and that's a clock. So that clock is basically it's a cycle, and there's work being done. If you take the normal clock and you run a game, then it has a pretty much a predefined envelope that it's going to run in, and it'll give you a certain set of frames per second. You know, there's voltage, there's power, there's current that is balancing to try to give the user the best experience. Now, when you overclock uh, something like the graphics processor, you're basically giving it, or you're uncorking more of the headroom that's built in there. If you can imagine, when a manufacturer like NVIDIA or AMD, when they sell a graphics processing unit, a lot of them are sold, or the chips, you know, they're sold what called binned uh, chips. When they're making a graphics processing unit, it's probably going to be on a silicon wafer, and they'll produce the graphics chips and they'll put it on the power board, and they'll say, hey, we have this set right here. It's going to be the high performance ones. They can run at this clock speed. Then we have another part of the wafer that didn't do too well. Um, so we're going to run the clock a little slower. Maybe it's the lower model, the 3090 being one of the highest models for NVIDIA, 3080, 3070, 3060. And of course, a lot of them have some of their GPU components, called cores, disabled, as well as frequency uh, constraints on there. Sometimes you might see like uh, they'll take a die and disable some of the cores on there, but they'll still run it at a high frequency. That way they get some performance out of it. Um, but on the RTX 3090, it's going to have pretty much the full cores uncorked, and you're going to be within a certain megahertz range. So the first application uh, well, before I even get to the application that tells you what kind of clock speed you're running at, one thing you want to know is you probably want to know what graphics card you have, number one. Number two, you want to check out the specs. So I have the specs here in this browser window here, RTX 3090. It's got 10,496 cores. It has a boost clock of 1.70 gigahertz, a base clock of 1.40. We'll get more into that later. It comes with a memory size of 24 gigs of GDDR6X. The memory bus is 384-bit. Second generation cores, RT cores. Uh, Third generation Tensor cores. It's on an Ampere architecture, and it supports all these different features that help accelerate not only games but software applications uh, and rendering. So first thing you want to do, number one, figure out what your specs are for your graphics card. The next thing you want to do is there's a lot of tools out there. One of the tools that I use to tell me what kind of or to validate what kind of graphics card I have is TechPowerUp GPU-Z. If you heard of CPU-Z, it's pretty similar. It's basically going to analyze uh, from its database, similar to the specs that I have here. You'll notice that it said, or NVIDIA said, quoted that 1.40 base clock. You'll see here that's pretty close. 1.40 is in gigahertz. This is 1,395 megahertz, so that's 1.395 gigahertz. And then it said a boost clock of 1.70. You can see the boost clock here, 1,605 megahertz or 1.695 gigahertz. So let's get more into that. It can be kind of confusing because when you're overclocking a CPU, it's a little more straightforward. Perhaps you have a CPU that runs at a base clock of, let's say, 3.6 gigahertz, and it can boost up to let's say 5 gigahertz or 4.9 gigahertz. So you can kind of see that there's a difference between the base clock and the boost clock. So basically the CPU will adjust in between those gigahertz ranges. For a GPU, it works in a similar way. However, you have a default clock that almost never runs at that clock, if that makes sense. It's kind of confusing. If you look at this other application I'm using, this is called MSI Afterburner. This is the tool that I'm going to get into later that lets you overclock. You can see that the GPU clock is varying, and that's because there's an adaptive voltage and current, and that's also going to vary the voltage depending on the application load. So you may load a software like Adobe or a game like Dirt 5, and it will spike up that GPU. Another tool you can use that comes with NVIDIA type GPUs is the Geforce Experience. If you see here down in my toolbar here, NVIDIA settings, Geforce Experience, I have a shortcut key that when I launch it, you can see that it comes up with the Geforce Experience. I click on Performance, and then you can see the same specification metrics that you see in the TechPowerUp GPU-Z, except this is coming with the default software. You'll notice that it has both the analytics here, the specs, and it has the overclocking portion. So from top to bottom there. So this is real great because in the past, if you're an old school overclocker, whether you're overclocking a CPU or GPU, you either did that in the BIOS or you did it with tools like MSI. But now NVIDIA, or even AMD, they build in the overclocking directly into the software. And they have something that's called automatic overclocking. And that's what you see over here on the left side pane here. If I enable the automatic tuning, it's going to basically scan your video card. It's going to give it some GPU load, and you'd see the megahertz start spiking here. I'm not going to run this automatically here, but if I run this GPU-Z render test, you'll see that this megahertz is going to jump up. Notice it doesn't match the default clock, but if I start the rendering, actually I have to close this off, start the rendering, you notice boom, it jumped to the boost clock and then immediately to another clock which is not shown here. So we'll get more into that later. That's an interesting aspect here. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that test here. You notice it jump back down. We don't have the NVIDIA panel here, but it's going to basically do the same thing here. But I'm going to focus more on these tools here. Now I'll get back maybe into the NVIDIA's overclocking tool. So what is that mysterious number there? You have the default clock 1395, boost clock 1695, then it jumped up to 2070. So in your mind, you're like, wait a minute. So if it boosts to 1695 or 1.7, why is it running higher? Well, it turns out that the default and the boost, they actually run in between a clock that runs even above that. So I don't even know what that name would be called. Let's call it the extreme clock. And even this lower clock right here, what is that? Is that a minimum clock? So it's not as straightforward as you might see in the CPU, and even the CPU can vary too. But basically, if you run a software, it's going to load up. It may run between 1395 and 17 or 1.7 gigahertz, or even higher, 2.7 or 2.07 gigahertz. So the reason why I might hit 2.07 is because I have a core clock adjuster here, and you notice it's 90 megahertz. If I take out my calculator here, let's see if the math adds up. So if my boost clock was originally 1695 and I had an adjustment of 90, and that's at 1785 megahertz, so 1.785 gigahertz. So actually, when I overclocked the core clock using this MSI Afterburner, it actually moved the boost clock to 1785. Well, one thing that's not shown here is if I actually didn't overclock this and I had this back at 0, then it would be running at 1695. So let's do a little math here. Clear that out. We notice that uh, when I had my max clock, it was at 2070, right? By minus 90 from that, it kind of shows you another clock, 1980. So if I didn't have this overclock, I've actually seen this here. If I go back to stock settings to default, I've seen the GPU run around 1980. Sometimes it hits 2, depending on the load. So you're actually getting more bang for your buck because NVIDIA and AMD cards, they have adaptive overclocking that's kind of built in. But when you actually overclock the GPU and you're actually increasing that envelope, going from default clock to that maximum overclock that's past the max boost. So that's a real good way of getting more performance out of your GPU. So that's the core clock. If you run a lot of benchmark tools, I'm not going to show it here. I'll probably do another video on that. A real popular one is 3D Mark, Firestrike, and Time Spy. So those are not really games, but they're based on game engines. So a lot of people use that to kind of gauge between, well, if I run that benchmark, it gets this score. This 3090 compares to a 6900 XT, compares to a 6800 XT, or compares to an RTX 3080. You kind of see that there's a ranking that will come out of that. And some bragging rights will come out of that too. It's like if I run Time Spy on this RTX 3090, I might hit above 18,000, or you might get some overclockers that are hitting 20K on that too by using liquid nitrogen. Same thing with the AMD cards. So when I run the core clock here, plus 90, I'm going to get a better score in those kind of, we call them synthetic benchmarks. It's kind of quasi-synthetic because it does run some workloads that are synthetic, but it does run a game engine, which is pretty similar to what's going to be found in a regular normal AAA games. It's going to have a game engine that's going to be accelerated by the clock speed and the cores on this graphics card. So that's the core clock. That's definitely going to give you the most performance. There's also something called memory overclock. So you notice that it's not quoted on here, but this RTX 3090 comes with 24 gigs of GDDR6X. And it does have a clock as well. You'll notice here 1219 megahertz. It's kind of confusing because then you might look over here. Well, here's the memory. It's running at 5001. Well, if I start to render, it's going to boost up. So really, there's some multiplication going on. Most likely, what's happening is the GDR6 it's accomplishing more tasks per clock. It may be doing 2 or 3 or more, and that actually becomes multiplicative to this number here, this 1219. I won't go into the math here, but normally this GDR6 will be quoted to be running at almost 9.7 gigahertz here. If I stop the test, it's going to clock back down to half that, roughly half that. So between 5,000 and 10,000 megahertz, or 5 and 10 gigahertz. You can overclock that as well. I've tried some applications in that, like the benchmarks and software, and I do see a performance increase. The numbers go up on the benchmark scores, and the applications is kind of hard to gauge unless you run something like an app timer or some other metrics to tell you that, well, it is running faster. For a game, you can probably get better metrics because if you notice over here on the right, you have a frames per second indicator. When you overclock, the frames per second is going to go up. Um, you'll probably see something between 5 and 10% frames per second. So if you go through a scenario, typical scenario, so let's say I'm running Dirt 5. That's a game that you can run on console. But on the PC, using this card, I'll probably hit around 90 to 100 frames per second overclocked. If I bring it back to default, um, probably about the same, but a little bit lower, maybe 85 to 90 frames per second. Um, you notice that there's 2 frames per second indicators you see here: the average frames per second and the 99% frames per second low. You might see that as 1% lows, but basically you're gonna have a minimum, a middle, and with the middle being average, and then the high or peak frame rate. On this NVIDIA overlay, it's actually going to be uh, for frames per second, it's going to be the average, and then the lowest frames that you would hit. And you can see whether the GPU is being utilized. You'll notice mine's being utilized at 21% voltage, zero point 0.7 GPU watts, 82 watts. That's pretty low when it's close to being idle. But when I'm gaming, you'll see that go up to like 400 watts. On an AMD card, probably less. You probably at a full load or 75% load, you'll probably see the AMD hitting around 320 or 350 watts. So it's a little more efficient on the AMD cards. But on the NVIDIA cards, not as efficient, maybe 50 watts more. Uh, but like I said, this is not a laptop. This is a desktop application. So as long as you have a good power supply, you're going to be able to run this card. And when you're building a PC, uh, there's also some sizing that's involved in your PSU, and I'll probably get that in another video. But we'll say for this RTX 3090, I believe NVIDIA recommends at least a minimum of 750 watts. You could probably run it on a lower one, like 650, but it'll probably be working your power supply pretty good. Um, so let's say that they recommend 750. It doesn't mean that the NVIDIA card is running at 750. It's going to peak at a combined power, uh, or your system is going to peak at a combined power around 750 if you had that power supply. For mine, I have a 950 watts, so it'll peak at that. GPU probably hitting 400. Um, my CPU overclock, I've seen it hit, let's see, 150 watts, 160 watts, maybe more, 200 watts. So you're within that 600 watt limit, and the rest for the other peripherals like uh, your your hard drives, your SSDs, your NVMEs that they barely take up anything. But I'll get into it how to size that in another video. Getting back to this overclocker, you have the core clock and then back to the memory clock. I normally keep that at 0. I've tried combinations where I increase that. I've seen it at least 1,000 over, that's a tremendous overclock. So it would go from uh, a low of 5,000 to 6,000, a high of uh, 9.7 to you know almost 11 gigahertz. So um, I do see uh, the benchmark scores go up a little bit or minute performance in the games because a lot of games, the memory's going to be pretty fast for this type of card. For maybe the lower cards, you might see, or lower model or lower tiered GPUs, you might see more performance when you overclock that. One thing I noticed that, at least for this card, it doesn't run as stable, so I put that at 0. I'm more concerned of getting the GPU at higher megahertz clocks. One thing I do is I do increase the core voltage You'll notice a lot of overclockers, they talk about voltage. Well, they might say, oh, I'm going to undervolt it, which you could do that too. Maybe they're aiming to try to find the lowest voltage to give you the most frames. But I've found for this card that it runs a little bit more stable if you pump up the voltage to its max. So that's that slider. Uh, Last three sliders you'll have here is the power limit. A normal RTX card or any card will run at 100%. So you could probably lower that and see if you get performance. But normally, for running high frame per second games, you're going to want to max that out. So this GPU that I have has no mods. You might hear like, well, it has a shunt mod or shunt resistor so that it can go up to 125%. And with those mods, you'll see them hitting like what, maybe probably over 500 watts. Or you might see that watch just on the higher uh, performance RTX 39s that you get from the AIBs. They may have ones that come with exotic water cooling or various fan configurations, or they might throw in more resistors or capacitors or whatever to beef it up, and they can probably be running in the 120%. I remember my old 2080 Ti was a water cooled unit. Um, I think I still have it over here. If I grab it from my work area back here, I believe that I could overclock that power limit to 120%. So this is still a pretty fast CPU, but I'm going to be selling that to someone else that will make good use of it. But you'll notice that here's a GPU when you take it out of the case. This is a 2080 Ti, still a pretty top tier card, but this is a pretty beefed up card, and it can run by 120% over. Last time I had this installed, so pretty beefy unit. The RTX 3090s from NVIDIA is a pretty extreme unit. It's heavier than that one there, but the factory alone allows up to 114% overclock. Temp limit, normally these cards like to run around a max of 80 degrees Celsius. I've increased it here. I've seen the card running a game probably runs around in the 70s. If you're water cooled, like my 2080 Ti, it's a little slower than this card, but still produces a lot of heat nonetheless. And I've seen that one water cooled probably hit around 50 or 60, which is pretty good compared to a fan model. It's a lot quieter than this one here. But with this one, I kind of tweaked the fan setting. So you notice it says 30, and you're like, well, are you running it always at 30? I have it on auto, so if you click on this gear icon, the auto is actually pulling it from a fan configuration. So it's gonna increase the fan speed based on temperature. You'll notice that GPU temperature, mine's running at 37 degrees, so it's probably gonna have a fan speed around 45%. So very low. You notice that the fan's running at 800 RPM. But when it starts to boost up in a game, which is around this area here, 70 degrees, you probably get 70%. Um, so that's probably going to jump up a lot. I don't know what the math is on that, but when I seen my GPU in action running, I'll probably see a fan spinning around, I don't know, under 2000 RPM, maybe 1500 RPM, and it's still pretty quiet, um, even with that fan in there. If you run the factory fan, I've seen it boost up to like 2000 and above, like way up there, RPM, that's in revolutions per minute. And, once it hits that, it's pretty loud. So probably around 1200 to 1500 is acceptable. Of course, if you're overclocking, you're producing a lot of heat and you max this out, you'll be real loud, but you'll probably get more stable frames at a higher clock. But I'm trying to find that balance between getting acceptable increase in frames, 5 to 10% more frames per second, but still be quiet, so that it's not as unpleasant. noise wise or decibel wise. So that's the fan tweak that I have here. So if I run this render test which simulates GPU load, it's actually running probably I believe this is DirectX 9 or DirectX 11 rendering. You notice that with my overclock I'm hitting 2070, and normally graphics cards they throttle, so this may go down to like 2000, but with this settings that I have picked here, uh, you notice that stayed around 2070. A lot of games they'll kind of bounce around. It depends on what's being rendered, so you might see something go between the I'd say as low as the boost clock. I've seen 1695 to up to this 1900 or 2000 megahertz. So you notice the RAM went up, the voltage, boosted that up. Temps are, around 49. Well, it's not really a gaming load, so gaming load you might see more. So I'm gonna stop that rendering test. Go back. You notice that the clocks for the GPU core and the memory went down. The voltage went down. Temperatures is going to go down eventually. It's fan, so it's a little slow. If you had water cooled, it'll go down even quicker because you have a pump and some coolant running through there. So just to wrap it up here, you want to find out the specs of your GPU. Download this tool, TechPowerUp GPU-Z. Overclocking tool like MSI Afterburner. I think EVGA has their own. So does PNY, and AMD will have their own overclocking tools. Same methodology though. Get the specs, figure out what clocks you're running, overclock and apply it, and run the game. So when you run the game, it might crash. Just be cognizant of that. Can it damage your hardware? Yeah. The manufacturers, they'll give you a certain warranty, and I've been pretty fortunate that they warranty it if something is broken, but they'll probably ask you, did you overclock it? And most likely they know you did. There's some headroom built into the hardware, so they do allow overclocking. But even with my 2080 Ti, didn't have any problems overclocking that for almost 2+ years. Could have ran even more. You don't really need a beefy system like this, but if you're frames per second junkie, right? Frames win games, then you're gonna want to have at least a RTX 3090 or AMD Radeon 6900 XT to get some good performance overclocking. So that's all I have for this episode. In the next episode, I'll probably get into CPU overclocking, or maybe even I mentioned getting into PSU calcs. How do you size the power supply for your computer before you do a build. So that's all I have for this episode. If you like this or you have some suggestions, please visit my channel, the Mr. Umer channel, and please subscribe and like and comment. Uh, and I will see you next time. Take it easy.